Okay, welcome everyone. It's very exciting.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.
I'm speaking second for Team Romania. My preferred pronouns are he or they.
Thank you. And third.
Hi, I'm Vlad. I'm speaking third, and I prefer him or they.
Sorry, that was Vlad, right?
Yes.
Wow. And then who'll be giving the reply?
That's
it's me, Dodo. Yeah.
Thank you very much. On New Zealand, who will be speaking first? Oh, I've got yours in the chat.
Would you like us to introduce ourselves as well? Or?
I think for the sake of ceremony, feel free to.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Lucy and I'm the first speaker, and I will also be doing reply. My preferred pronouns are she, her.
Thank
I'm
you.
Millie. Oh, sorry. I'm Millie. I'll be speaking second, and she or her.
And third.
Hello, I'm Isabel. I'll be speaking third. My preferred pronouns are she or her.
Thank you very much. So I go by she or they. If you want to refer to me in your speeches, feel free to call me Madam Chair, but feel free not to refer to me at all. Does anyone have any questions before we begin?
I would just like to say that the internet is not very great where I am. So if you wouldn't mind, can I switch off my camera? But I'm very much here and listening.
Yes, definitely. If you switch off your camera, that's fine. Absolutely. And hopefully your internet will survive for the rest of the round. But let me know, perhaps send me a private message in the chat if you have any bigger issues with internet connection during the speeches. If I can ask all speakers just before they speak, just to clarify how they'd like to take points of information during the round. And I will get the stopwatcher to help you time your speeches. So you'll be able to see that on my screen, hopefully. So I hope that's visible to everybody. And in that case, without further ado, I'd like to call upon Todo to open the case for the proposition on the motion. This House believes that large international institutions such as the UN and the World Bank should only accept female country delegates.
Can you hear me if I speak like this? Is that fine? Okay, great. 1 sec. In a world where women are
Sorry, Toto. Sorry to stop you just as you started, but we just had a note from the opposition. So if you can just, everyone before they speak, just explain how you'd prefer to receive POIs.
That's right. I would prefer to have them audible, if possible. Okay, great. Thanks. In a world where women are suffering from severe underrepresentation at all levels of political decision-making, at the level of heads of government, at the level of national legislatures, we think that the least we can do in this ever more globalized world is to offer them a real stake in political decision-making inside of international institutions. I'm so proud to propose. 2 parts in my speech. 1, I'll be setting up today's debate by providing a couple of clarifications. Secondly, I'll be going into my team's first 2 substantives. 1, about how international institutions have an obligation to offer women an active stake in the decision-making process. 2, about our measure will lead to a massive shift in perceptions. My second speaker will talk to you about how our policy represents a launching pad for national political careers for women. First of all, a couple of clarifications. First, what sort of international institutions are we talking about? We're talking about institutions that are generally global in their scope, i.e. in the countries that are represented within them and in the scope of their decisions. Institutions like the United Nations, like the World Trade Organizations, like the World Health Organization, World Bank, IMF, and so on and so forth. 2, what does it mean for you to be a country delegate? We have to understand, first thing first, that a country delegate is oftentimes just one individual. In most international institutions, there is one individual that plays this role of representation. 2, they are generally appointed by governments at the discretion of those governments, meaning that they can choose generally whomever they want and whomever they think aligns with their own political position the best. 3, generally, they follow a mandate from the government. They generally have to follow some guidelines that are provided by political leaders. Fourthly, they do have negotiating power. This looks like country delegates within the United Nations negotiating on the specific wording of different resolutions in order to establish a formula that best fits their country's interests. So they are indeed bound to follow some guidelines from national governments, but they also do have some real decision-making power. What does our policy do? We would think that the executive leadership of many of these organizations would impose that they would only receive female country delegates. This looks like the United Nations Secretariat telling countries that they will have to only bring female country delegates. We think that this is likely to be accepted by all nations in the world, since they care more about being represented in one of the most important fora of international debate, international decision-making, 1 second, rather than just giving up on a man that they wanted to put in that position. Before I go into my first substantive, if there are any POIs.
When nations care deeply about their sovereignty and the ability to have individual choice, do you really think they're going to buy into you forcing them to make a particular decision?
Yeah, ma'am, sure. Some of them might not be super happy at first about it, but even countries like Saudi Arabia currently have female diplomats within their ranks. We think that it's not as big of a change for them to give into this sort of decision just because they badly want that representation to happen. First argument, international institutions have an obligation to offer women an active stake in the decision-making process. Look, the international bodies that we have in today's world are the ones who are supposed to be making decisions on the behalf of the entirety of humanity and affecting the entirety of humanity. The legitimacy of decisions coming from these bodies at a global level rests on procedural ground, meaning that thank you, because of all religions, of all ethnicities had a say, that means that they are all bound by the decisions that these international institutions make, at least at a principial level. However, there is one glaring exception in today's world, and that is women. At all levels of political decision-making, women are being crowded out. In parliaments, at the level of who is an MP in most countries, vastly dominated by men. At the level of heads of state, most of them in the world are men. So there is a systematic underrepresentation of women within most countries. Therefore, we think that in this current setup of these international institutions, no thank you, the decisions of these institutions are not international in scope. They're not global in scope because they leave out half of the world's population. In order for these decisions to be truly global and to hold legitimacy in front of all the people in this world, we have to fix the issue of representation. Okay, why do international bodies have to impose this? Because realistically speaking, they're the only ones that can really do it. They're the only ones that have enough power and international clout and prestige to induce this form of representation. In the case of individual countries that may have sexist national governments, it is unlikely that they will take that position themselves. And to appoint, for example, a female head of state. So we think that the only way for it to induce some form of representation is to force this thing at the level of national country delegates. We think that since countries desperately want a seat at the table in the most important fora, they're just going to accept it. Why national delegates, though? Because they're the only real stakeholders in the decision-making process at level of most international institutions. If we talk, for example, about the staff of the United Nations Secretariat, although they do support the works of the United Nations, they're not the ones actively taking the political decisions. If we really want women to have, no thank you, active political decision-making power, they have to be part of the political decision-making process. That means to be a delegate who's the one voting on resolutions, voting on decisions of various fora. Why all countries? Because we think that these international institutions have equal obligations towards all of their member states. We acknowledge that there are many power disparities within these institutions, but we think that we should always err on the side of treating all states as equally as possibly, as equitably as possible. This is why on our side of the house, we think that this is an obligation that should be imposed on every single state, not on half of them, not on a couple of them. No, thank you. That's not enough. Note at the end of this argument, this is not contingent on pragmatics. You do not have to have, even if there would exist some backlash, as team opposition might want to prove to you, we think that it doesn't matter. Because we think the just decision to make is to have this representation happen in the first place. We never asked ourselves whether giving women suffrage would cause backlash or not, because we didn't think that it was, no thank you, an important calculation to take into this process. This is our principle. 2, this leads to a massive shift in perception. Second argument. We think that although many of these institutions may not have effective decision-making power, they have a lot of symbolic clout. When the United Nations General Assembly convenes, all eyes in the international media are on them. Speeches inside of that forum are broadcasted around the world. In times of an international pandemic, the World Health Organization is, no thank you, looked at as being authoritative, as being a trendsetter. They're at the top of the global decision-making hierarchy, even if just at an image level. We think that this offers them enormous symbolic power. So we think that there would be an enormous impact if all of these national delegates would be women. Just imagine how Jacinda Ardern coming into the United Nations General Assembly with her baby made so many headlines around the world. Our policy would make even more. This would be the talk of the town. What are the concrete impacts? First, at a broader level, we think that this is sending a signal that women are indeed competent and that they ought to take an active role in the decision-making process. We think that this leads to more role models for young girls, more empowerment. But secondly, at a national level, we think that in the cases of systematically sexist countries, one powerful role model is enough to deeply shape perceptions. Benazir Bhutto becoming the Prime Minister of Pakistan made huge progress for the perception of women inside of Pakistan because it showed a powerful woman that was able to take decisions on her own. Even in the case of less sexist countries, we think that representatives like Nikki Haley, that ended up becoming the darling of the Republican Party, can still make huge progress for women's representation. So because we want to have women have at least one seat at the table, please vote proposition.
Okay, I thank the speaker very much for that speech. I'll just pause for a second so I can get acknowledgement from the judges that we're ready to move on.
Yes, I'm ready.
Yeah. In that case, oh, sorry.
Just saying, good to go.
Oh, great. Sorry, I couldn't tell if that was a hold on 1 sec or a good to go. In that case, without further ado, I'd like to call upon Lucy to open the case for the opposition, and just a reminder to give your preferences about points of information at the start of your speech.
Awesome. Can you hear me all right? Great. And if you could just do like vocal POIs, that'd be perfect, so I can hear them. So I guess we'll start. Forcing nations to send only female delegates to international institutions results in a complete collapse of these institutions and any legitimacy of their decisions. They are not only perceived as less legitimate, but countries will actively reduce their participation or leave when they can no longer control how they conduct their foreign policy. Additionally, though, the perception of women shifts dramatically because they are seen as people who can only get into those positions by having doors open for them rather than them actually being able to get them of their own merits. That is how we win this debate. What do we stand for? We stand for the gender-blind selection of delegates. That means that countries can send whatever delegates they want. Broadly, we're very happy for the United Nations to encourage the representation of women among delegates. Importantly and contextually, we think that, firstly, the problem isn't as great as they made it seem. There are plenty of representation of women delegates within these nations. We also tell you that generally the trend is continuing as social attitudes progress. The proposition team actually brings those attitudes backwards. But we also think they can broadly encourage that the women become, that there are more female delegates. What do we stand for in this debate then? 3 main points that I'm going to bring you. Firstly, what principally delegate selection should look like. Secondly, why this massively weakens and delegitimizes these multilateral institutions. And thirdly, how this reflects poorly on women and the feminist movement as a whole. Note that most of my rebuttal will be integrated, but firstly, let's just quickly respond to their principal material about the obligation of these nations to offer them an active state. We have 3 key responses to this. Firstly, as we already flagged, we think it's untrue that women are always unrepresented in these organizations. In a lot of cases, they are represented. They do have a stake in the decision-making policy as delegates and also as supporters to those delegates in diplomatic decisions. And they told us about people like Jacinda Ardern. They told us about general social progressiveness. We think that continues to exist. Secondly, we think this is contingent on women actually being represented where they wouldn't have otherwise. We think at the point where a majority of nations pull out rather than having a female delegate or only resentfully create that female delegate, they don't actually have any discretionary power because nations don't actually give them any of that power. Thirdly, we think all of this is predicated on the important on the importance of women in politics. If we prove we get massive backlash towards women in politics and overall decrease their power, that obligation actually becomes more harmful. The comparison to suffrage here was completely crazy. We think that instead of just bringing women to an equal perspective platform, you're actually making them higher than men. That is a greatly different principal obligation. On to that then, what's our principal obligation in this debate? We tell you what delegate selection should actually look like, 2 principal frameworks. Firstly, we think importantly multilateral institutions like the United Nations are crucial world organizations which broker peace and help countries be able to cooperate, just literally decide whether people starve or are saved from famines, cooperate in those ways. It is fundamentally not a place for virtue signaling because the massive role it plays in people's lives, we think the fundamental obligation of these institutions should choose the best possible delegates because they told us that delegates have a role in how those decisions go successfully. They told us they do things like negotiation, they have discretion. We think that at the point they need a wide range of skills. When you rule out half of the potential pool that could be chosen, you're necessarily locking out the people who could have been good candidates for an arbitrary characteristic they cannot control. At that point, you are not creating, the obligation is not there because you're actually necessarily choosing worse candidates in some cases when you limit that pool to an arbitrary characteristic.
Right.
Second principal framework, though, if you take a purely feminist framework to view this debate, we think this directly contradicts the core values of feminism because it's about raising the status of women to be equal with men. The goal is to open doors to women, not close doors to people who are not women. When you do this, we think firstly you make women appear less capable of receiving those jobs, but secondly, if you believe in the tenets of feminism, you cannot stand for locking those who aren't men out of these particular positions. That is never what feminism stands for. And the end of this then, what are the practical harms we see? Secondly, why this massively weakens and delegitimizes these multilateral institutions. Because as we already told you, we think these institutions are incredibly important. They uplift people out of poverty. They broker peace. But the important piece of context that was failed to be engaged with by the proposition team is that their power only derives from the buy-in of other nations. Because contrary to what they try to tell you, when the UN comes to a decision, the decision only is followed because of the buy-in of those nations. Additionally, though, we tell you that they're also incredibly unstable. If nations back out, they are likely to collapse. The League of Nations collapsed because it didn't have enough buy-in because of other nations. We think that is incredibly important. How then are these institutions weakened? Firstly, we just think the quality of decisions and the resolutions that they pass will be decreases. Because at the status quo, you have delegates who are both male and female, who have years of experience and understanding of nuance, the ability to understand how their country's foreign policy works on a really deep intrinsic level. At the point point where you take those people out, and as we already told you, you're not choosing the best possible delegates, that's incredibly harmful because it means the decisions they make are going to be worse. It means that they are less able to respond quickly in a crisis like COVID because they don't have the best possible delegates who have that particular experience because they've completely cut them out. Secondly, though, and really importantly, we think they lose all legitimacy. This is something they framed as really important, right? They need to respond to this material. We tell you nations don't buy into multilateral organizations. Their only material here was effectively to say, we think they buy in because they really care about the benefits that organizations give them. Why does that not happen? Firstly, we think they probably feel like the policy is worse quality because of the principal material I already gave you. Even if the policy isn't worse quality, they still think it's worse because they have been not able to give delegates that they really cared about and really wanted. Secondly, though, we think countries are massively affronted by what they see as an affront to their sovereignty, right? There are two key facets here. Firstly, nations that already contain sexist beliefs or aren't aren't creating delegates who are women in the first place. We think that they feel like the West is imposing cultural norms on them and are massively angry about this decision. We think this means that they are incredibly angry by the fact that they can't send someone who they agree, especially because these are often religious or cultural practices that the public care about a lot within those nations. That's incredibly important. But secondly, we think even in more progressive nations, they hate an interference in their own policy because we're necessarily telling them that they have to send a particular person when they wanted to send someone else. Especially, we think this plays into the narratives of conservative groups within those nations who often already have some kind of resentment towards multilateral institutions, want to turn away from them, are sick of them meddling in their affairs. At the point where you tell them they cannot choose the kind of people they want, this is an affront to people's basic sense of equality or the ability for anyone to be involved in a decision. We think that means they are really unlikely to buy in to those decisions. There's going to be public outrage that's really harmful. Yes, I'll take you.
So you talk about how the UN makes these incredibly important decisions, but then you tell us how nations are just going to pull out because they are forced to place a woman in the national delegation. Which is it?
So they're incredibly important, right? Often nations don't recognize the importance of those decisions, particularly the public don't recognize the importance of those decisions because they are so affronted by this massive sense of their equality, these issues with their equality. What does this look like then? We think in the worst case, lots of countries leave those institutions because there is no way that countries like Saudi Arabia are actually going to buy into having a female delegate. So where women need the most help, there is no moderating influence because they pull out. We also think that nations like the US, which already have animosity towards multilateral overreach, now completely do no longer buy into that. That's massively important because, as I already told you, these institutions now collapse and can no longer help people. Even if they don't do that, right? We think that what happens is they no longer participate in those institutions to the same degree. They no longer fund them to the same degree because there's no public capital behind doing that. Finally, how this really poorly impacts women as a whole. They told us that it's suddenly seen as a role model. We tell you this isn't the case. Firstly, because we think it creates a wider outrage against the feminism movement as a whole. It goes against the tenets of feminism, but affronts people's personal sense of fairness. It also feeds into anti-feminist narratives that they want to shout out men and are man haters. At that point, you have far less social capital behind those feminist reforms. Women are far less likely to be in other political spheres because they are seen as lesser, as weaker, and not able to deal with men on their own playing field only by shutting men out. At the end of the speech, then, what you have is multilateral institutions that are far less powerful, far less able to do the good work they do, but you also have women being perceived as weak and as not capable. That's not the kind of world we can stand for on this side of the house. Proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech. I'll just look around and check that the judges are ready to move on.
Ready.
Great. Also, I think at this point, it might make sense to say, unless you have a preference other than POIs being audibly offered, you can just carry on with your speech and just speak up if you want them to be offered in a different way to how the speakers have offered them so far, for the sake of saving time. In that case, without further ado, I'd like to call upon Valeriu to continue the case for the proposition.
Can you hear me? Is it fine?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So team opposition, surprisingly, comes with a very sexist rhetoric because most of their argumentation is on the quality of the delegates, about how these women are going to be less qualitative. So that means that the entire institution collapses because we put women in office. I think this is extremely sexist and it's kind of surprising from team opposition. But what I'll do in my speech is I'll have 3 main rebuttal points, then I'll further the case for my colleague, and then I'll have my own argument regarding how you have a launching pad for a national political career. Let's see what team opposition provided in this debate. First of all, they talked about how social attitudes progress and how we have more and more women into the United Nations, into international bodies. First of all, we already explained in our setup, these women exist, but they are far and in between. And mostly they come from very progressive states because these states already accept that women should be equal to men, and they do have women delegates. But for most other countries like Africa, Eastern Europe, for Latin America, these women aren't delegates. And even if there are some women delegates, they aren't important. They are used there as tokens. My colleague on the first speaker already explained how there are some women delegates, but they're usually low level. They don't have any decisional power. Side opposition actually agreed. They told us that they assist the actual delegate. This is the role of the women on their side of the house. So please, judges, don't buy their entire rhetoric about the social attitudes that progress. This is an ongoing battle that we have to help in, because this is not going to change itself. We won't let side opposition run away with this. No, thank you. Moreover than that, the second thing they claimed is that institutions lose buy-in because states end up not believing that these institutions are qualitative anymore. Their first reason is that they're weakened because there's less quality from the women delegates. I think this is contingent on these women delegates being worse than their male counterparts, which is already a bit shaky. But we're also telling you that because they want to have the best delegates possible, what states are going to do is they're going to train these women in diplomacy. They're going to try to have the best delegates possible. So we're telling you that there's not going to be a loss in quality. So this means that their entire mechanism just falls flat on the ground. Now, the second mechanism they have provided here is that I won't go to the United Nations because I can't put a man there, so my sovereignty as a state is attacked. Let's go back to our setup, guys. We explained how these delegates usually have to play on what their governments want them to do. They don't have full decisional power. They still respect some governmental guidelines. No, thank you. But they do have decisional power when it comes to decision making. So we believe that the sovereignty of a state is not attacked. The policy that they're going to try to implement is the same. Moreover, I as a government can put whatever woman I want. If I'm the Republican Party, I might want to put a woman like Sarah Palin that already was the candidate for vice president. We're telling you that even the conservatives can have some women that they agree with. So I think that I already addressed this entire point about institutions don't lose buy-in. If the response is that my colleague on first didn't convince you, but now let's attack their 30-second argument about the impact on women, because they told us that we feed into the sexist rhetoric. We're telling you that this is very problematic, and we already addressed this from the very first speech. Even if there would be some backlash, we still believe that this isn't enough of a justification to not put women in positions of power. We shouldn't not have women CEOs because there's going to be backlash from the conservatives. We shouldn't not let women to vote because there's going to be backlash from the conservatives. And please compare some backlash from conservatives versus you have women as role models in the highest institutions in the world. We believe that it's more important to have this than to have some conservatives that are pleased because they don't see women on TV. Before I move on, sure.
If multilateral institutions make a mistake, would it immediately be blamed on women and therefore set them back immensely in terms of their perceptions on the international scale?
Thank you. Generally, when we talk about the mistakes of these bodies, what happens is that we talk about the mistakes of governments. When a Russian delegate does something horrendous, it's not the Russian delegate. We don't know his name. We know the fact that it was the Russian delegate. So we say that Russia did something bad. But moreover, even if there would be some backlash because those are the women in power, we're telling you that in most situations this is uncomparative. We believe that the conservatives that hate women this much are going to do so on their side of the house as well. We don't believe that there's going to be a huge impact. We believe that most people are going to look up to these women that are the highest degree of diplomacy. They're an emblem to the entire world, and we believe that this is more impactful for them. Now, no, thank you. Let me further the arguments that my colleague provided. They went largely unattacked. They said nothing nothing about our shift in perceptions, actually. But the first argument, they attacked it by saying that women are already represented. I already addressed that. They said that women have to be represented in this case, so we have to prove that women are more represented. No, just by having those women in a position of power, we believe we increase representativity. So this is the comparative you have to make. Most governments are controlled by men. Most secretaries are men. Most people in power are men. So we believe that the least we could do is at least have these delegates be women, so that you sort of equalize the playing field when it comes to the power dynamic. We believe that our argument still stands strong after the first opposition. So now I'll enter my own argument, but before that, sure.
Okay. When women like Jacinda Ardern are so successful and seen as such good role models because they've been able to rise above the adversity that faces their gender, how does your side of the house still get strong role models when women have faced no adversity to reach their positions of power?
First of all, this is contingent on women getting over that adversity, which generally doesn't happen because there are so many systemic barriers that most women aren't able to get over that adversity. Moreover, we believe that they still have to face adversity. They aren't just you're not going to take a random woman off the street and put her at the highest level of international politics. It's going to be a very qualified woman. It's going to be somebody that is an expert in their field. We still believe they faced a lot of adversity. We still believe they have a great story, if that's what side opposition wants to talk about. Now, my own argument regarding how you have a launching pad for a national political career. And here there are two main things you have to take into account. First, that women generally can't convince political parties to endorse them. Why? Because when political parties look at them and look at their chances, they usually can't see them in a leadership role. First of all, because they might have some intrinsic biases, but secondly, because they generally don't have the CV necessary because of all the adversities that even side opposition wants to admit. What does this do? You have women that were delegates in the most important international bodies that now have the CV to convince the political party, look, I am more than capable, I have the CV necessary, I was already in a leadership position, you can endorse me, which means that it's easier for them, there's less friction inside the political party for them to actually become a political candidate. But secondly, they have to convince the electorate. And here you have three main categories they have to convince. First of all, the progressive voters that are not going to vote automatically for you just because you're a woman. You have to prove yourself, which means they're going to vote on merit. They're going to vote on your CV. And we believe that having that representing your country in the biggest international body possible, it's a great CV to have. So you are more likely to win these votes. About the sexist voters, we believe that you won't convince them on either side of the house, but it's easier to silence them the moment that you have this CV. But moreover than that, the moderate voters, which are the majority of voters, the fact that you have a United Nations or World Bank CV is going to be massive for them. This is one of the biggest diplomats inside their own country. What this means is that after these women come back to their country after being a delegate, it's easier for them to start a political career and it's easier for them to change politics inside their own nations. This is why we propose.
Okay, judges, are we ready? Yeah, fab. In that case, I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon Millie to continue the case for the opposition.
Sweet, can you hear me? What was crucial about Jacinda Ardern sitting in the United Nations holding a baby? Was it that a woman was sitting in the United Nations? Is it a woman was good enough, was strong enough, was smart enough to sit in a room with men all around her and represent her country at that level? Frankly, all their material falls at the point that these international institutions are no longer seen as equal places for the best people to go, rather places where the best woman goes. In a world where women are seen as lesser, the UN will not have the legitimacy it does. It will be seen as a place for second-rate female politicians who weren't good enough to contest the big boys. What am I going to do in my speech today? 4 things. First of all, I'm going to deal with the principal contention about how delegates ought to be selected. Second of all, I'm going to walk through what happens to institutions in the first place. Third of all, what happens to women. And fourthly, my substantive contribution about why the diversity of global decision-making is necessarily going to fall under their side of the house. First of all, onto the principal contention about how delegates ought to be selected. First of all, we agreed with the initial analysis brought to you by First. That is, that because of the scope and the reach of these institutions, that everyone ought to have a voice. That's why we disagreed with the rest of their principle. Because, Chair, it was never true in their speech that you were going to get more representation, because we think there are far better ways of achieving this. They told you that there is no way that you're ever going to have other representation than through force. We think this negates decades of gradual shifts toward more positive female representation. These shifts that have meant that in the 1940s, there were 0 people sitting in the halls of the UN who were female, to today now where you have like tens of them, like 10, 20, 30, 40 of them. And it continues to go up more gradually. They then told you this was never going to be true, because what was going to happen is that countries that were less progressive were going to fundamentally shut women out in the first place. 2 responses to this. First of all, we think that the United Nations and other international bodies has the capacity to pressure countries in order to change their rules more generally. We think this looks like the current Secretary General standing up and saying it's an utter travesty that women aren't represented more. This means that you have places like UN Women actively fighting for more women and more minorities to be represented as a seat on the table. This means that we've seen an increased push from the institution itself to gradually shift on the bounds of their own things. This is why countries like China, hardly the progressive beacon that they wanted to point to, now has a woman delegate in the General Assembly. This is really crucial, because you can get representation through means by just encouraging people rather than forcing them in the first place. Secondarily, they told you that it's important because women couldn't get stuff otherwise. We tell you what is crucial is that you have everyone represented. We tell you men, in this case, also have issues that ought to be heard in the General Assembly. They do not listen to the men who have crucial concerns that are equally valid to those of women. We want equal representation, not shutting the door on individuals who wouldn't. Let's move on to my next material. What happens to institutions themselves? Because first of all, we want to flag something really critical in Science Propositions material. And that is that implementing this model in a world where institutionalized sexism is still a problem, where the men that are going to be selecting these women are still necessarily sexist and still necessarily operate in sexist governments. Even if these institutions don't fall, which I'm going to move on to later in this pledge, why are these people not necessarily going to be the worst? First of all, in countries where men see women as lesser, they're probably going to strip their specific delegates of opportunities to have far more discretion in what they do. This means that you're going to install women from particularly privileged backgrounds who can be controlled by their male staffers to negotiate in ways that they think are specific. Secondarily, we think that these women are going to be removed from negotiating responsibilities, and you're going to implement junior delegates in order to do these things. Third of all, we think it's probably quite likely that countries will begin to engage in more bilateral or multilateral negotiations, which don't specifically engage with the UN mandates. This means things like, for instance, the US going and negotiating with the African Union unilaterally rather than going through the United Nations. This means that even if the UN continues to stand, at the point you still have systemic sexism. This means that these countries are going to disempower these female delegates who they necessarily seen as less qualified. I'll take a POI right now.
Ma'am, there's a huge contradiction in your case. Do we have like a massive progressive trend, or do we have this entrenched sexism where even a try to put in more female delegates will make every country lose it and pull back from these institutions?
Here's the thing with transition. Transition doesn't going to happen right away. We think over the next 20, 30 years, it's probably quite likely that the United Nations is going to be far more equal than it is today. What's critical is if you do it right now in this moment where you have people who have unseen feelings of sexism to do something they think is against their morals, you're going to have a massive backlash from them. We think if they begin to learn, begin to become more progressive on their own merits, this doesn't occur. Second of all, why people pull out. They told us it was a contention in our case, and they told you that if we say that these bodies are important, then people are necessarily going to stay in them. Why is this not the case? A few reasons. First of all, the United Nations is really important to this world, but it's not particularly important to the most powerful nations, and it's seen as particularly important for those individuals who operate under those systems. We tell you these are highly technocratic organizations with relatively opaque operations. Your average worker doesn't really understand what happens in the WTO. Second of all, people really care about sovereignty. They told us this wasn't important because people can still decide what things they sign. We tell you it's really key because you're removing half the people who people can operate with. We tell you this is analogous, for instance, for the UN saying that you can't operate in unilateral negotiations between, for instance, Canada and the US. You're just stripping away a bunch of their capacity to engage foreignly. We tell you what this means is that people that don't understand the UN are likely to instead prioritize social issues, which they see as really key in their environments. This means more conservative individuals in places like the US caring far more about what happens within their own social system than they do abroad. Finally, onto this point about women, because they often have points about feminism, but it's parroting the idea that they don't really care about backlash. We brought you three really clear mechanisms that were really important. First of all, it entrenches the position that women in powerful positions are necessarily weaker than men, and therefore must be given a separate pool to sit in rather than being able to compete with the men on their own terms. Second of all, you're going to have wider backlash against feminism, as they see it as an overreach, as to which wants to strictly control international institutions rather than engaging with men. Thirdly, we told you that you're going to have wider backlash in things like multilateral organizations at the point that countries like Saudi Arabia necessarily do not engage with them. This was really crucial because backlash was really important here, Madam Speaker. Backlash is really important at the point that feminism and feminist alliances are really crucial at pushing things like legislation in the third term. We tell you it's things like backlash that stopped things like the ERA from passing in the United States. It's backlash that stopped women from having access to adequate contraception and adequate birth control. That's really key. Then they brought you two bits of analysis. First of all, you would have better role models. As the second speaker acknowledges, no one knows who the people represent them. No one knows their names. You're not going to have role models in these opaque organizations, which like 7-year-olds don't particularly follow. But second of all, this isn't going to be a launching pad because people are just going to see it as like a second-rate job. They're not going to see it as an equal thing in a CV, as you would, for instance, a normal diplomatic position. Why does this then lead on to the global decision-making decisions? Because this is mostly covered in my points of clash, but very briefly, it's really key that we represent these opinions. Why are you going to get less opinions representative? First of all, we tell you that countries are going to prioritize diversity, necessarily going to deprioritize these kinds of issues more broadly. They're going to deprioritize, for instance, having refugee representation. They're going to deprioritize having feminist legislation going through their parliaments. That's really critical in today's debate because we want that representation internally. Second of all, we tell you that men have critical perspectives. Thirdly, we tell you that replacement organizations that are going to spring up in places like parts of the Middle East are going to be places where women are systematically excluded as to provide a stark contrast with other countries. And finally, we tell you that you're significantly going to bar women from policy positions like scholarships because countries are going to backlash against those scholarships, backlash against those positions and not offer them in the first place. They systematically fail to prove to you why these institutions be seen as valid. They systematically fail to win this debate. Thank you.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech. I'm just checking that the judges are ready. Yeah. And in that case, without further ado, I'd like to call upon Vlad to continue the case for the proposition.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Cool. The political system is going to collapse because we've given women the right to vote. The political system is going to collapse because women are now in parliament. Sounds very similar when you look at it from a historical point of view as team opposition stands. We think that generally we as humanity should make progress, and generally, even though we have seen every measure that gives women rights as going to be a collapse, it wasn't a collapse. We've gotten over that. This can happen furtherly with our motion. Second of all, We think that they keep saying that they want equal representation and that we should keep a 50-50, but they're not interacting with the status quo. Do not let them act as if they're protecting an equal representation status quo. No, they're protecting a 95% of the delegates being men and probably a 5% being women, which is New Zealand, maybe Germany, and maybe some other progressive country. Most countries, 95% of them, do not even question whether or not their delegates should be men or women. This is what they need to defend. This is the trend, the progressive trend that they're defending. A question that we should be asking in this debate, and that I think answers a lot of team opposition's contention, is why only women? And I'm very happy with the second ops analysis about how these institutions can be very racist, and the process of negotiation can be not racist, sexist, and the process of negotiation is very sexist. No, thank you. It's because if you don't make it only women, then the women that are inside that negotiation process will be discriminated, will be disregarded. They won't have the strong voice that they're having. Unless you create a full women body, then they won't have the voice that we want them to have, because other male delegates will just disregard them, just won't listen to them, because they think that, oh my God, a woman cannot be telling us what we as humanity should be doing. All their analysis proves why we need only women to be part of this negotiation process. But note that this also proves that it's very unlikely for a country to change. And all the progressive trend that they're speaking about is very unlikely to happen precisely because of this point. Because if one country decides to push women as their delegates, the results that they will be having, because she was disregarded, because their country's guidelines weren't listened to, and they didn't manage to achieve the purposes that the country has because she was discriminated, A, it's very unlikely for them to continue on doing that, and B, it's very unlikely for other countries to pick up on that trend. So unless we make a break in this sexist cycle, there is no way a thing truly changes other than that 5%, which is, in a team opposition's perspective, equal representation. A very important aspect in my first speaker's speech is that we have mentioned that politics generally are heavily dominated by men, right? Both on a national level, international level. What does that actually mean? It means that they already are overrepresented in a lot of ways. It means that they already are the main voice when it comes to those guidelines that the delegates have. They already get representation on a big level there. However, we have a very specific place in which we could possibly be breaking that, because we think that you don't have any jurisdiction to impose on a national level. You as an international body, you have no jurisdiction to impose them to use women in their national consensus and create those guidelines by women. However, you have the power to force everyone to delegate women, because it's part of the process of your international body. You are in a very specific place which allows you to break that sexist circle precisely when it comes to the representatives that are presenting those guidelines and that are the ones that are negotiating, right? What does this actually mean? Precisely because we are speaking about, don't panic, please, I'll take you later. Precisely because you are speaking about representatives, it means two things. A, it's not a meritocratic basis. So it's only like a political appointed person that is the representative. It's not somebody who wins a contest. So there's no meritocracy that we should be speaking about. B, it's a huge symbol. It's the head of the state, the person that has all the power of a state. This is literally just patriarchy of a family, as the male always takes the decisions and talks for the family just on the biggest level possible, right? So we think that we've proved that on our second speaker, we've proved that this is also very likely to spread out into the national level and help women in their national politics. So we think that we have a very specific gap that we could be changing to give only women the chance to be the voice of those male-dominated guidelines, that we have the power to change. We should be taking that opportunity that we're having to be helping women. So at the end of the day, we think that we are the only ones that give a specific opportunity to women to be represented. They don't have any other chance on the comparative on their side of the house. Before I move on, I'll take your intervention if you want.
The US left the Paris Climate Accord because of what they saw as an overreach on their discretion, even though it was a non-binding agreement. What's to say they won't do the exact same thing with the United Nations?
So first of all, US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, because Trump thought that it was attacking the national coal system and they would be losing economically. So it's just a purely political decision. So it has nothing to do with them being, it has nothing to do with our motion. Second of all, speaking of why these countries won't be affected by this, won't be affecting the body, two reasons. It's simply not worth it. So we are facing immense international community backlash because you're no longer part of the UN, which is supposed to be bringing peace to humanity, just because women are now your delegates. Second of all, precisely because they need that body in order to have decision-making power and to get a say in the international consensus. It's a huge part of their international power. So they won't be just giving it up just because they will need women, and precisely because they still give guidelines, right? It's not women just going there and taking the decisions of what they want. They're still representing the national interest. Further of all, because women will be delegates for all countries, so it's not like we're only forcing some of them. And further of all, because you would look like the biggest sexist country if you just withdraw from an international body just because women were your delegates. It would literally look like you are the most extreme sexist country just because you have done that. We think that even Saudi Arabia has women as diplomats, even though they don't give them much power. They keep them as diplomats just to have that international view, as they are not so sexist and they want to hide the truth behind them. So it's very, very, very unlikely for a change to exist in the international body. We think that on the level of perception of women, I'll add three things. First of all, just note how important and powerful the message that we send is, precisely because the normal population won't understand all the legislature behind it. The simple fact that they are seeing that a woman has achieved peace for their country, a woman has settled a huge important loan for the restarting of their economy. Just the fact that they're seeing women having an influence on their daily lives is a huge difference that is going to be happening in their view. Second of all, the comparative is that on their side of the house, women finally have a chance to be seen as capable, because on their side of the house, they're already seen as not capable of doing the stuff in the politics. On our side of the house, when they have a good result, they finally have a chance to show their power.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and providing the judges are ready, I'll now call upon the next speaker for the opposition, Isabel, to continue the case.
Everyone can hear me all fine? Cool. I just like POIs the way everyone else has received them as well, please. Okay. In this debate, we didn't stand for locking women out of bureaucracy. We didn't stand for having 95% men in positions of power. We told you within the first 10 seconds of our first speech, what we stand for is not locking all people who aren't women out of power. We stand for things like UN Women. We stand for things like trying to get more women into politics, like having scholarships from Ivy Leagues to countries where women are particularly disenfranchised. We stand for things like the UN and the World Trade Organization and like WHO campaigning on women's issues and trying to make active change in women's lives. What we don't stand for is having the terrible implications of collapsing these world bodies, but furthermore leading to the massive implications and harms on women and feminism as a whole that occurs on side proposition. 2 clashes to bring to the House in this debate. 3 clashes to bring to the House in this debate. Firstly, on the principal obligation which acts in this debate. Secondly, why the multilateral organisations are massively undermined if you implement Proposition's model. And finally, the impacts on women, in particular feminist narratives. And to this principal obligation, note this is where side proposition has tried to win this debate down their line by simply arguing, as they told you at first, they don't care about the practical outcomes at the point where they have better role models for women under the status quo. No, thank you. So what did they tell you? They told you that these institutions have an obligation to give women an active role here. The analysis was that women are locked out of these institutions and therefore they're not actually legitimate because they don't represent half of the global population. The second thing they told you it's the only place where they can actively induce proper representation. In response to the first level of analysis, we think that women aren't locked out of government and bureaucracy in the way that they told you. It's not just 95% men in the UN if you actually looked at a picture of what the demographics look like. We think there are general progressive trends, particularly in Western nations, which are pushing for more women representation. We think, yes, some countries still have relatively conservative beliefs, but there is a general trend, which means we are getting more women representation. But furthermore, onto this analysis, we think, right, so under the status quo, maybe women face more adversity than men in getting into bureaucracy, and therefore these institutions aren't legitimate. When you are actively locking out men or people who aren't women and saying you cannot join these institutions, we think they're no longer legitimate under the same framework Proposition tried to tell you, because now you're actively not allowing these institutions to represent, say, the views of men within your society. We think they lose that material on legitimacy simply because it exists on their side of the house. What we tell you is that these systems, it's incredibly important that we have this obligation to have the best people representing things. We told you that at the point where you already have a limited pool of people who are qualified to fulfill the role you need in these institutions, and you lock out half of the population who is able to do this, you probably lock out half of incredibly qualified people who are particularly good. Not here, we never said that women are bad or incapable of their abilities to perform their duties, but simply if you look at how statistics work, you are going to be locking out incredibly capable people. We don't think it should be an arbitrary thing like your gender, what's your gender, which you can't control, but instead should be on your merits. The second thing we tell you is it goes against the core tenets of feminism and what is important about equality. It's not about locking men out, it's about making women as valuable and as equal as men in society. We think women should be given the opportunities to succeed with men, not just by locking them out of the race. They don't win on role models here, on just this principal analysis. And they can't win this debate. Before I move into my second clash, I'll take a POI.
Women are already basically locked out, but even if they wouldn't be, if you don't do it only women, precisely because these institutions are sexist, you won't have any success and they will be still discriminated.
Okay, I completely reject the idea that women are just locked out completely. We just don't think that's true. We've already explained to you about the progressive trends which exist in society. They never told you why these institutions were all just incredibly bad. But furthermore, I think we're happy to stand for changes allowing more women in these institutions. We don't think the pendulum is able to swing to such an extreme and you're going to get any of the benefits they tried to claim. We need to have more gradual shift and the massive overhaul they're suggesting. And to the second clash around why the organisations are massively undermined. Note here, at the point where we just collapse these organisations, we have way less public buy-in. They don't get any of the benefits of having good women role models or just having better policy for women they tried to stand for. And we just think these organisations are incredibly important and should be preserved. What did we tell you? Firstly, that countries need to bind these organisations for them to exist. We tell you this means that they need a mandate, countries need a mandate from their population to involve themselves. we tell you here that people within countries just recognize that it's like generally going to be sort of unfair that you're implementing a model like this. Furthermore, they don't like overreach and where their sovereignty is being imposed. This is particularly in countries which don't follow Western norms and values. They're not going to enjoy like a Western value of feminism being imposed upon them, and probably going to like not be excited for this proposition. Thirdly, we expand on this and I tell you that some places and people are frankly just sexist and just don't think women should be given the same opportunities. This is in progressive countries like the USA, New Zealand and Australia, but also in more conservative like Muslim majority countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan or the Congo, Somalia. We tell you the UK pulled out of the EU because of the way they had to label their product, but just because there was less public buy-in into this system. We tell you people are going to be incredibly unincentivized to engage with this model. What does this mean? It means that there's way less political capital for states to remain engaged in these institutions. Even at the point, no thank you, where they don't pull out of them altogether, it just means there's less public impetus to like have a massive budget to give to them. This means like decreasing your funding in the WHO, not being inclined to send peacekeeping troops to like particular aid like efforts. We think all of this means that you lose the legitimacy of these institutions and you lose their ability to enact actual change in policy. We tell you that that's all incredibly important analysis that exists in our state house that they never properly wanted to engage with, except just asserting that like, oh, it's going to look super bad at the point where you pull out. We tell you it looks really bad when Yemen is the worst country in the world for like how women are likely to be treated, but they're not going to change that simply because of the optics which exist in that country. Countries do things which look bad all the time just for the sake and what their society wants. So finally, on to women. They talked a lot about like how perceptions change. We tell you that just simply doesn't happen. And we gave you 3 reasons they never wanted to engage with. We told you that there's just wider backlash against the feminist movement. In particular, multilateral organizations always face problems and backlash. When most things go wrong, people are just likely to instead blame the organization's problem, instead blame women. Why are they likely to do that? Just because they're sexist and bad. It feeds into negative like feminazi narratives which encourage that women are like incredibly problematic, like that just want to lock all men out and take over the world. At the end of this, we think the perception of women is far, far worse on their side of the house and you get way worse narratives. At the end of this debate, we protect institutions internationally. We don't force women into a corner in which they're villainized and ridiculed. Proud to negate.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech. And now, if the judges are ready, yeah, would call upon Lucy to summate the case for the opposition.
Panel, I know that in a debate about women's rights, sometimes other outcomes can get lost in the weeds. But when multilateral organizations collapse and lose all forms of legitimacy, when you massively decrease support for them on the international scale, women are not served because they no longer get the aid packages that the UN sends. Women and children no longer get the medical aid and free vaccines provided by the WHO. When they are no longer supported by those institutions, they are not served, and that is the pathway by which we win this debate. Additionally, though, we gave you another framework by which we can win this debate when we tell you that women are active, the perception of women actively is harmed at the point in which they are seen as only able to get success by locking out men, at the point where they are only seen as like the lesser women who are only able to get in there through these organizations. 3 main points of clash in this debate. Firstly, we're going to briefly deal with the principal clash. We think this mainly comes down to outcomes. Secondly, what actually happens to the multilateral institutions. And thirdly, what happens to the perception of women as a whole. Firstly, the principal clash in this debate. They tried to tell us that it was really important that the United Nations and other institutions always like uplift women, and importantly, they give women a say in those programs. This was never actually engaged with the fact. We told you there are other ways for the United Nations to do that. We tell you they can have things like UN Women, which actively uplift women. They can use their soft power to encourage nations to do that. They never actually gave us an obligation for them to completely restrict the access of men to these things. We also tell you, though, that the obligation of these institutions is just for them to create the best possible policy, to actually be able to make a change. At the point, that's then based on practical outcomes in this debate, right? But it's also the obligation on them to choose the best possible person for the job. It's not sexist to say that when you take out half of the available candidates for a job, you are necessarily not going to be able to choose as better equality a candidate. Secondly, then, what actually happens to the institutions? This is absolutely critical to the debate because the most important outcome is that multilateral organizations are still able to function. Even if they win on all the women reputational stuff, we are perfectly happy to concede that at the point in which the UN is still able to function within society, because that's incredibly important overall. They tried to frame this as like, we're just giving women's rights and nations won't care. Firstly, we just told you to do a basic sense check on that and think that nations truly will not care at the point where you tell them a delegate they really want they can no longer have. But we also tell you this policy isn't just seen as feminist. We tell you it's seen as sexist because it's blocking men out. It feeds into anti-feminist narratives of feminists as man-haters. We also gave you a bunch of mix about why nations will care about this. Firstly, because it goes against their core senses of fairness. The public will massively backlash because of all of the reasons I already told you. We tell you they take away nations' individual discretion. Countries are already touchy about giving things like the UN power over them. You now dictate who they are able to choose. We finally tell you they're seen as imposing Western cultural values, something they're already touchy about. We tell you, broadly, multilateral institutions are losing power. They have a lack of sway over people. At the point in which you do this, you make it massively worse. Why is that so important? We tell you, even if only a few nations pull out or there is slightly less political capital, these institutions are massively weakened. We also tell you this has a cascading effect, right? Because at the point where some nations pull out, it has even less power. That means more and more nations are likely to pull out over time. That massively weakens those institutions. Finally, then, what happens to the perception of women? Because even though we told you we're happy to trade off, we think we also win on this point at all. Because the extent of their analysis here was that women are now in positions of power and therefore respected. As we tell you time and time again, women are seen as only getting into these institutions because men were shut out. This leads to a massive backlash against women and a negative perception of them. The alternative, the comparative, is allowing social attitudes to progress by having that kind of soft power that leads to those representatives in the long run. Additionally, we think they made a really important concession when they tell you that women are will be lauded for the success of those institutions. We tell you that means that when those institutions are unsuccessful, which they will be, the perception of women is pushed back 30 years because they're seen as causing the failure of those institutions. Additionally, when you tell them those institutions are already going to collapse and become much less powerful. The most important thing in this debate is that a massive form of changing nations' discretion and ability to just decide who they want to do is only going to lead them to pull out, only going to lead them to not care about those multilateral institutions overall, and only harm women in the long run. Proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and finally would like to call upon Toto to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole.
Am I audible? Is it fine if I speak like this? The Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. They're erratic. They're going to backlash against this decision. But how about Team Opposition tell us what happens to the rest of 190-something nations that don't pull out of the Paris Climate Accords? Look, we may be willing to forgive you if you believe like governments to be so erratic in the era of Trump. You have to realize that in the real world, not everyone can afford to be just as erratic in their decision-making as the Trump administration. The vast majority of countries can't afford to lock themselves out of global power structures, to throw a hissy fit just because they have to place a woman in a position of power. This just doesn't happen, panel. Before anything else, one strategic note. Team Opposition debate. They tell us there is a progressive trend. Everyone is pressured into being progressive. But then when you try to actualize this progressive trend into a policy as we want to do, suddenly everyone just cops out. No, we can't do that. Panel, we gave you a clear and reasonable portrayal of what happens on our side of the house. Indeed, some countries have made some concessions to women. Yes, China does have some diplomatic assistants who are women. Saudi Arabia does have some diplomats who are women. But they don't give them actual power because they don't have to. They have nothing that forces them to do. So let's do a small rational calculus as a self-interested nation. If I, as Saudi Arabia, have to choose between just investing a bit more resources into making sure that my female diplomats have all the experience to represent me well, and then doing this thing where we just try to bypass the UN in all sorts of decisions. We only make bilateral agreements. We start creating new regional organizations because we don't want to be part of the UN when there is already an entrenched structure in which countries can negotiate between themselves in the UN, when all of the big money is at the World Bank and at the IMF. So okay, they tell us, oh, but governments just don't think that these things are as important. No, team opposition. Only we, the enlightened debaters, are aware of all of the important things that international organizations and developing nations have no idea about the reality of the importance of these decisions. Of course, they realize that these decisions are important. Of course, if all they have to do is just train some female diplomats more, it's just a rational decision to do that. No international organizations collapse on team opposition. This is simply a debate land massive impact that never would happen in real life. Panel. Let's talk a bit about what else was discussed in today's debate. On principle, right? They tell us, oh, but these diplomats have to be chosen on expertise. Look, we've explained to you from the get-go, this is not what they're chosen on. Nikki Haley wasn't chosen because she was the best diplomat of all. It's because the government trusted her. It's not about expertise. This is not the real criterion on either side of the house. We told you our very clear argument on first. You need to give women representation because in the vast majority of instances, they are locked out of representation. Sure, for every one delegate that exists within the United Nations General Assembly, and we do agree that there are some female delegates in the United Nations generally, there are hundreds of male MPs, hundreds of male government ministers around the world. If we really want global institutions to be global, not just in name, we have to offer women some form of stake in the decision-making process. This alone wins us the debate. But on international organizations, again, I've just explained how it simply does not make sense for any country in the world to pull out of the World Bank because they have to place a woman as a delegate in there. It just the cost-benefit analysis goes against team opposition's own content, right? And last but not least, on perception. Sure, conservatives are gonna be too happy. But then again, they never were when we gave women any form of rights. But this is a real way in which to show young girls that women can't be part of decision-making processes. To show sexist or rather misogynistic countries that sometimes women can do a good job if you just give them the power to do so. For all these reasons, because we were the most realistic and more reasonable portion of today's debate, we're gonna win it.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech, and I'd like to offer congratulations to all speakers in this debate. So feel free to give some sort of virtual round of applause. Thank you very much, everybody. The judges will now, as soon as we get a helper here, move to our deliberation room, and we'll be back with you as soon as is possible with our decision about who will be advancing to the octafinals.
Thanks for the debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you guys for the debate.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.